I wasn't digging through census files when this caught my eye. I was simply double-checking late 1800s immigration trends, matching naturalization papers against population stats, the usual genealogy routine. The kind of work that's supposed to be routine and predictable. You spot a name in 1900, follow it back to 1890, then 1880, and piece together when and where your ancestors arrived. Straightforward. Except it never was. Every search, every database, every family branch I followed suddenly dead-ended at 1890. Not because the people vanished or left no trace, but because the official records themselves had been wiped out. 62,979,766 Americans. Names, home addresses, jobs, immigration details, naturalization status, family setups. Everything captured on June 1, 1890. All of it gone. The standard story is straightforward. Destroyed in a fire on January 10, 1921, in the basement of the Commerce Building in Washington, D.C. But the more I examined what really took place, the more that tidy explanation started falling apart. The fire only consumed roughly 25% of the documents. So what happened to everything else? Let me be clear about exactly what disappeared. The 1890 census wasn't just another head count. It was the most thorough portrait of America ever attempted until then. This was the first census to use Hollerith's electric tabulating machines and punch cards, the same system that later became the backbone of IBM. It was also the first to dig deep into immigration and citizenship questions. Not only, where were you born, but, how many years have you lived in the United States? Have you filed your first papers? Are you fully naturalized or still an alien? What language do you speak at home? For women it asked how many children they had borne and how many were still alive. It recorded Civil War service, Union or Confederate. It listed race using categories we no longer recognize: white, black, mulatto, quadroon, Chinese, Japanese, Indian. It asked if you owned or rented your home, whether you could read and write, and if you had any physical or mental disabilities. For the first time ever, they created individual family schedules instead of simple lists. Full household snapshots showing relationships, origins, and status as citizens or newcomers. This wasn't ordinary data gathering. It was a complete inventory of who Americans were at one frozen moment. And the timing made it priceless. The 1890 census was the one that officially announced the American frontier had closed. Frederick Jackson Turner built his famous thesis on this very data, claiming the frontier had defined the American character and its end marked the close of an era. 3 cities crossed the 1 million mark for the first time. Chicago became the second largest city in the nation. Foreign-born residents hit 14.8%, the highest share in U.S. history up to that point. And Ellis Island opened just 18 months later. The 1890 census froze America right before the flood of officially processed mass immigration began. It showed exactly who was already here, where they came from, how long they had been present, and whether they had become citizens. It was the baseline, the starting line, the record of the old America before the new one arrived. And then it vanished. Here's what actually unfolded. On January 10, 1921, around 5 in the afternoon, most staff in the Commerce Building had already left for the day. The building was quiet. A fireman named James Foster spotted smoke drifting through gaps around pipes that ran from the boiler room into a basement file storage area. No visible flames, just smoke leaking through. He alerted the watchman immediately. Fire crews rushed in, cut more than a dozen holes through the first-floor wooden surface, which had 6 inches of concrete underneath, and poured 20 streams of water into the basement. By 9:45 p.m. the fire was out, though crews kept dousing hot spots to be safe. And then something odd occurred. With the fire under control, the chief clerk opened windows to clear the smoke. Everyone except the night watchman simply went home. No urgent salvage operation, no emergency recovery plan, no rush to protect the soaked record sitting downstairs. They just left. The next morning was every archivist's nightmare. Water ankle-deep across entire sections. And here's the detail that still doesn't sit right. The basement had a proper fireproof vault. The 1880 census was stored inside it. The 1910 censuses were safely locked away too. But the 1890 records? They were piled on open pine shelves in an unlocked file room right beside the boiler room and a carpenter's shop full of sawdust and wood scraps, directly in the path of the firefighters. That's how the National Archives itself later described the setup. Damage reports conflicted wildly. Some said 25% was lost to flames. Others claimed another 50% was ruined by water and smoke. Yet at least one contemporary account noted that roughly 38% remained undamaged, nearly 24 million individual records that could have been saved. What happened to them? They sat in soggy heaps for months. Then they were shifted to a temporary warehouse, moved back to the census building, and finally stored away where they continued to rot for more than a decade. Meanwhile, historians, genealogists, and groups like the National Genealogical Society and the Daughters of the American Revolution wrote letter after letter begging Congress to preserve what was left. They received the same polite replies every time. No destruction was planned, an archives building would be funded soon, the records were safe. For 12 long years this went on. Then in December 1932 the chief clerk of the Census Bureau sent a list to the Librarian of Congress. Records no longer needed for daily business, marked for disposal. Item 22 simply read, Population Schedules 1890, Original. The librarian was asked which ones held historical value. He marked none. The list went to Congress. On February 20, 1933, President Herbert Hoover laid the cornerstone for the brand new National Archives building. One day later, February 21, 1933, Congress quietly authorized the destruction of the 1890 census records. A single day separated the cornerstone of America's official history preservation building from the order to eliminate the most detailed population record the country had ever created. A handwritten note later discovered in a Census Bureau file reads, Remaining schedules destroyed by Department of Commerce in 1934, not approved by the geographer. Someone inside had objected. It didn't matter. Out of nearly 63 million documented lives, only 6,160 names survive today, tiny fragments from just 10 states and the District of Columbia. Everything else is gone. The pattern lines up with eerie precision. 1890, census taken, frontier officially declared closed. 1892, Ellis Island opens, mass documented immigration begins. 1896, first fire destroys special schedules on mortality, crime, and special classes. 1921, second fire. Damages the main population schedules. 1933, remaining records authorized for destruction the day after the National Archives cornerstone is laid. 1934, final destruction carried out despite internal protest. The same decades we've been examining in this series. The same window when photos of unusually tall people stopped appearing, when newspaper stories of giant skeletons vanished, when Tartaria disappeared from maps, when the old world quietly ended and the new one took its place. And now we discover that the single document that would have shown us exactly who lived in America during that transition, where they came from, how long they'd been here, what languages they spoke, whether they were citizens, was stored outside the fireproof vault, hit first by fire and water, left to deteriorate for 12 years, and then deliberately destroyed. I want to be fair. There was no National Archives in 1921. Government bureaucracy has always been clumsy. Water damage to paper was genuinely hard to fix with 1920s technology. The Librarian of Congress had the legal power and chose not to save anything. Those are all plausible reasons why records can disappear. But they don't explain why only the 1890 census was left outside the vault while the others were protected. They don't explain the total lack of immediate salvage efforts when nearly 40% was reportedly untouched. They don't explain why 12 years of pleas from historians were ignored. They don't explain the timing, authorization granted the day after the archive's cornerstone. And they don't explain that internal note showing someone objected but was overruled anyway. Practically speaking, it created a 20-year black hole in American genealogy right at the nation's biggest demographic shift. Try tracing any family line from 1880 to 1900 and you slam into a wall. Not a thin wall of missing papers, a complete void. 20 years of history where individual identities simply cannot be verified through federal records. Immigration peaked. Cities boomed. The frontier closed. Civil War veterans were dying off. Entire communities rose and fell in the chaos of industrialization. And the one complete record that could have told us who these people were, where they lived, who they lived with, when they arrived, and whether they had become citizens, that record no longer exists. We lost the immigration status of 9.2 million foreign-born Americans. We lost naturalization details for millions more. We lost household structures showing relationships and surviving children. We lost Civil War service proof that could confirm or disprove later claims. We lost the only clear snapshot between the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era, the last picture of America before Ellis Island opened its gates. What troubles me isn't the fire. Fires happen. Records get damaged. Bureaucracies move slowly. Those are human mistakes. What troubles me is the coordinated silence afterward. For 12 years organizations that knew the value of these records were told nothing would be destroyed. Then in a single day Congress approved exactly what they had promised would never happen. And within a year or two it was finished. The portions that survived the fire, the 38% reportedly untouched, the sections that could have been dried, transcribed, or photographed, all of it was eliminated by official order, not by accident. The gaps looked too consistent and too convenient to blame on simple neglect. I keep coming back to one basic question. If someone wanted to make it impossible to verify who Americans really were before a certain point, what would they do? They would eliminate the one document that listed every single person, their origins, their immigration timeline, their citizenship status, and their family ties. They would create a 20-year hole exactly when the old America ended and the new one began. They would make sure anyone tracing their roots hits a wall at 1890. They would protect everything that came after while quietly erasing everything that came before. We've already seen how photos of unusually tall individuals disappeared around the same time, how giant skeleton reports stopped after 1920, how references to advanced pre-industrial tech were scrubbed, and how Tartaria vanished from maps. Now add this, the most comprehensive census in American history up to that point, the one that documented exactly who was living here during those transition decades, was also destroyed. Not coincidence. Pattern. The buildings still remember what the archives erased. The oversized doorways remain, built for people we can no longer prove existed. Family names continue without traceable roots. That 20-year gap cuts across millions of family trees, a hole shaped exactly like the truth we're no longer allowed to follow. What else was hidden in those records that made them worth destroying instead of saving? Why was only the 1890 census left outside the fireproof vault? Who benefited from a 20-year blank space in the American genealogical record? And if 63 million Americans can be erased from history through what officials called negligence, what else might have been removed the same way? What else have we been told was simply lost, when it was actually taken? The questions keep piling up. The pattern keeps repeating. And the 1890 census, the one record that might have shown us who was really here before the reset, was placed first in the path of the firemen.